The time is July 1991, and working man Dutch is dating the divorced Natalie, and he offers to drive her bratty, overprivileged 13-year-old son, Doyle, from his private school in Atlanta to his mother's home in Chicago for Thanksgiving. It is clear and apparent that Doyle is not interested as he blames Natalie for the divorce and wants nothing to do with mom's new boyfriend, especially given the assumption that the man's low working class roots. This pair makes for a journey filled with bickering, mishaps, and a tough life lesson for both of them. This week on Back to the Balcony, we kick off the holiday season with this underrated John Hughes written comedy, Dutch.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony.
So, Antonio, I don't know about you, but we kind of hinted at it in the last episode. But this is one of those movies that have been on repeat during the holidays for me year over year. It's one of those that is on my top shelf of just holiday movies to make sure I revisit. This one is almost a surprise to me that this didn't really get a big following after its release, or it just didn't have a really good following during its release. So this is one of those underrated comedies that I think really does need a revisit. And given what our critics are going to say, it actually did surprise me revisiting this review.
Let's talk about this really fast. It bombed hard. Like, it was a box office failure, and for the most part, it was a critical failure. And I'm really trying to think about, like, when it came out, because I didn't see this in the theater. It doesn't have as much of a Thanksgiving holiday repertory in my household. If we're going to watch a John Hughes Thanksgiving movie, we watch Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. That's just where we're at. So after doing this rewatch, I kind of agree a little bit more with our critics, and I'm not as harsh as they do, but it really is just kind of a minor key and more family-friendly version of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. But then I got even thinking more into it because we talked about it a little bit on the Weird Science episode. I always forget how obsessed John Hughes is with, like, class warfare, right? Breakfast Club is a perfect example of that. 16 Candles, Pretty in Pink, Curly Sue, all these movies that he's written, he's really obsessed with the differentiators between classes. And it's not always necessarily middle class. It's like upper crust and then lower middle class, working class, blue collar people. Maybe that just goes to the way that he was raised, maybe being raised blue collar and then, being able to be considered a Hollywood elite for the longest time. And sometimes I feel like in his later works, he becomes less attached to the idea of creating a very solid story and full of characters to express those terms of the class warfare, and just kind of does it really heavy-handedly later on, where it's a little too on the nose. The fact that this is the same year as Curly Sue, it feels that that's definitely where he was with his writing at the time. He's getting towards the twilight years of the John Hughes films that he had written, right? I think he had like 9 months after this and Baby's Day Out, but really this is kind of towards the twilight time of his career. And it was all self-driven. Like, he wasn't shut out of Hollywood. He chose to exit. So I'm not going to say that he ran out of ideas, but as I rewatched this movie, the first thing that struck me was it just doesn't really feel as original as some of his earlier works do. Now, is that a hindrance to me? Not really, because I do enjoy the performances of Ed O'Neill and Ethan Randall, now known as Ethan Embry. They're good. They're great. I like their chemistry. People will say, oh, he's just so bratty. Well, that's the character. And in my opinion, I think they could have done a lot worse with making him unbearable. If he was unbearable, I'd have no investment in this movie. But you can see the light at the end of the tunnel for this kid, and so it does have my buy-in. I am invested in the character.
I'm not going to disagree with you at all. And to your point, I'm not going to disagree with the critics to an extent. Not, again, agreement, not as harshly. But here's kind of the thing is we take John Hughes out of it, and it's hard for us to do it because this is kind of the height of his career. And again, you nailed it with Curly Sue coming out, and we get this raw feeling from Dutch and then Curly Sue. This doesn't, to me, feel like a John Hughes film. You have the situational behavioral conflicts, the contradictions, but the direction style that we get from these two films is a little bit more dirty. It's a little bit more raw. It doesn't scream
Right.
comedy. It doesn't scream the fun factor. And it's almost like John Hughes did a really hard pivot when it comes to what he does after Curly Sue to really go over the top with some of the movies that he wrote and kind of was just merely fluff films or a slave for Disney, I would say, in some aspects. But I think what really saves this is the kind of the relatability of the Ed O'Neill character and those that were a fan of Married with Children. It really did set that foundation to that pivotal character to stand by himself in a movie like we saw from Tim Allen in The Santa Claus just a couple years later, to really kind of drive and prove that he can hold this character. But my critique to this is it is a little too Al Bundy in this movie, and Ed O'Neill never really steps out of that character. And even though it's enjoyable, it's just a little too relatable to the Married with Children uh, character persona. But this to me is a conflict that kept me engaged. And even with rewatches, these two, one's extremely bratty, one's relatable. And that's what really keeps it engaged when it comes to middle America versus this bratty kid that you just want to kind of root for Ed O'Neill, and you don't know where you want to go with it. If you want to keep rooting for him by the end of the movie, or if you really want to see these two bond. And I think the success of this movie is we feel good by the time the credits roll, is they really find that niche towards the end of the movie where we really do feel good about the relationship where it landed.
No, I agree with you. I think that one of the things we have to say about that character that Ed O'Neill plays, Dutch, I mean, Ed O'Neill really didn't have a chance to really prove his box office chops or his leading man chops in movies. Most of the time, he was either like a secondary character or a bit part, and this was his opportunity to like really be the guy. Let's go back a little bit though, because this was not originally written for him. This was written as a John Candy vehicle, and you can tell the character is a lot goofier than Ed O'Neill portrays him. So when Ed O'Neill does go the goofy route, I mean, it's almost written like an Uncle Buck type character in a way, but he brings the blue collar mentality and the like kind of tough guy to it that I think moments that were meant to be funny, that were meant for a laugh, they come off a little bit cringy. You know, I kind of like squint a little bit at some of those scenes because I can tell that the performance doesn't match the dialogue. Now, also, Hughes had very little involvement in this production because while it was being made, he was currently writing, producing, and directing Curly Sue. So he was far removed from this project. And I think it really shows with a lot of the John Hughes films that he writes. If he's not directing them, it is very hard to find a filmmaker to capture his energy and voice in the filmmaking. Howard Dutch does it really well because they just kind of had like a symbiotic relationship. He knew how to direct Hughes films. But other than that, and maybe Harold Ramis directing, if it's not Hughes directing the movie, you often feel like it's a misplaced sentiment in the film. And that's where this kind of feels. I think the big thing, too, that I had a lot of issues with this movie is that it doesn't know how to tell the story equally between the kid and between Dutch. I feel like for a film called Dutch, we're expecting it to be really told through his perspective and his point of view. And I feel like most of the movie is kind of being told through the kid's point of view, and we're not supposed to like him at first. So it gives us like a hard time to follow that narrative, especially when he's being a real asshole for the first half of the movie. But there are enough fun little John Hughes moments in between, like with, the Call Girls, E.G. Daily, one of my favorites. That's a great scene. It's a great break from the monotony of these two at each other's throats. So that's like one of my only real complaints about this movie's energy is that it doesn't know at times which narrative to follow. Are we following Dutch's or are we following the kids, you know?
So this is gonna be a butt movie for you, I can already tell. That's amazing. So, but here's the thing, I loved the banter between the 2, and I love the uncertainty of having a specific point of view between the 2, because that really does show the back and forth conflict between Dutch and the little brat. Because when we get into it, and I'll push back a little bit, because even though it doesn't feel like a John Hughes film through your eyes, to me, when we put Curly Sue and this one almost the same year, the same kind of feeling, the same tone, it really does have that certain feeling to it that really does feel like they're very similar. And when it comes to John Candy portraying this, I think that would have been an even bigger mistake, because that would have been even closer to Uncle Buck, because the character is written so almost copycat to that, that we would have just gotten a repetitiveness to it. So, but again, that's the double-edged sword here, because when Ed O'Neill takes over, we get a Married with Children, Ed Bundy kind of feel to it, and it never really quits. It actually goes all in by the time we get towards the end of the second act, where it really does feel like we're watching a Married with Children movie where Al Bundy's on a road trip. And then we get into the last act, where it really does feel a little, and this will be my butt, it does feel a little rushed and cliche. And that goes into the balancing issues with this, is it really doesn't know how to pivot or transition based on the conflicts that's presented on screen. So it kind of goes into the hookers, and then we go into let's just get home, and then we see nothing in between until we end up on the doorstep of the home, and then we see the father, and it's just rushed. So but I think it's earned it. But does it earn the 2-hour runtime? It doesn't, because there could have been a lot that's taken out, or some dialogue taken out, to really have these two just really go at it, give us some situational pieces to it, and then let's move on. So I think the identity crisis of what this movie has is its true fault, because it really never proves the point of what a John Hughes film is trying to do when it comes to the written dialogue.
Identity crisis. Yeah, identity crisis is the perfect word for it, because there's definite moments in the film where I feel like it was for John Candy. For example, the way Ed O'Neill plays this character, it's not 100% believable or funny, the fact that this kid can roundhouse kick him and knock him down. Also, I don't feel like Ed O'Neill's portrayal of Dutch would let a hooker steal his wallet. He'd be too smart for that. He'd be too almost experienced with that. But if it was a John Candy role, if it was an Uncle Buck, well, yeah, that makes total sense. It would be very comical, almost Fatty Arbuckle-ish, if a small kid could roundhouse kick him and send him flying across the room. That's why I say, like, I really feel like there's too much of the original concept in the film for it to really work with Ed O'Neill. But that's picking hairs. Like, I'm still going to laugh at it. I still think it's fun. But I do understand where the critics do have their complaints with it. There's something formulaic, though, about this movie, isn't there? Because, for example, JoBeth Williams' character as the mom, Natalie Standish, she's just kind of a waste. We don't have enough connection with her to really empathize with what she is going through. She only has 2 or 3 scenes, and Christopher McDonald coming in as, you know, the wealthy dad. Well, all he has to do is show his face in that little pencil mustache, and we know that we hate him, right? He's good at that in any movie. He can just show up and be like, oh, he's the bad guy, 100%. But that's one of the things where I feel like this does feel like a lazier John Hughes vehicle, because the characters aren't fleshed out as well as they are in other projects that he's done. JoBeth Williams isn't very fleshed out. The side characters aren't very fleshed out. In fact, it is E.G. Daily and Ari Myers as the 2 call girls that feel like the most genuine and sincere characters in the movie, and they're only in it for 10 minutes. Here's the thing, too. I didn't realize this until I did a little research on Weird Science. He actually had his own cinematic universes. So his high school films like Pretty in Pink, Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, the Shermer High School movies, those all exist in one universe. And then this film, Home Alone, Curly Sue, Career Opportunities, they all exist in their own cinematic universe, which is why they do feel more similar to each other than the high school ones. So if that's his approach, when he's sitting down at his typewriter and he's saying, okay, what world does this story take place in? I feel like he already is like made headway of what that is going to feel like energy wise. And I think that is why when we talk about Curly Sue, how they feel so similar, it's because they're supposed to be in the same world. And these characters, who knows, might even have interacted with each other at some point. So I think it's really cool because you can tell in his writing and his style that he's not writing individualistic stories. They're part of something bigger. And this definitely feels like that.
You said something that just now, and it really did spark kind of almost a disappointment, and I hate you for
Uh-oh.
that because you pinpointed something that really did take this away from me a little bit. And that's with we look at Dutch, and you talked about Williams, and we don't get enough screen time, and that is absolutely correct because just the year prior, we get Catherine O'Hara in Home Alone that could have easily gone the Natalie route
Mm-hmm.
here and not had enough screen time. And writers usually evolve based on what worked, what didn't work. And we don't see that from Hughes here to really give that depth to the character at home to add to that conflict. And that really does take away from what the film is trying to prove, that the mom is not the bad guy. And I think an added couple scenes here and there that we saw from O'Hara in Home Alone to add that worrisome, that care, that empathy, really would have added to this movie. And I think that really adds to the gruffness of the Ed O'Neill character. And I think if both of these characters had one additional scene with Williams, that would have taken this movie up a notch. And especially with a holiday movie that you really want to feel something. We feel the conflict, we feel the planes, trains, and automobiles concept of it. It is a formula movie. But just an additional 10 minutes or take one conflict out of this movie and insert Williams in this to show some emotion would have really taken this to a new depth. And I do actually, now that I think of it, agree with you on that. But at the same time, I think the big fault to this movie was one, the emotional depth, a July Thanksgiving release that went for the emotional element, and the fact that we really didn't get a smart direction here when it comes to how this movie plays out when it comes to the character direction.
Right. And that's the thing is like, if you think about it, the ending of Home Alone and the ending of this are very similar in the sense where Kevin McAllister kind of looks at his mom as the antagonist, right? Until he actually faces real bad guys. His mom is the one who's kind of keeping him under lock and key and keeping him in check. And he doesn't like having these rules and regulations and expectations. Well, this kid's the same way. And they both have that same sentimental moment at the end where it's, I don't want to see my mom because she's the reason why we're not a family anymore. But then he sees her and his face brightens up. That is the reward of these two, but it doesn't feel earned because, like you said, she's not in the movie enough to earn that moment. All of that responsibility is put on Ed O'Neill's shoulders, and it shouldn't have to be. I get that he's trying to prove the point that, oh, we're, blue collar guys, we're a little lower class, and we don't have rich daddies to bail us out, so we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to be men. But at the same time, the approach to it is weird, where they're going to beg and pretend and almost con their way into getting rides to get home. Well, where's the honor in that? I think there'd be more honor in the fact of like, okay, we do need to ask for help, and a real man shouldn't be afraid to ask for help, especially when there is resources available. So maybe that's the adult me looking at it and like, that's not the message I would teach my kid. But as a kid, it made sense, and it's going for the funny. And I think that's where I have to be a little bit more forgiving of this movie, is John Hughes will always go for the funny first, and then he'll go for the emotional second. And if you're not in the mindset of watching a movie like that, then you're going to be annoyed that the emotions seem melodramatic and overly sentimental. Well, they kind of have to be if you're going for the funny first. So it's like a free pass because I expect that from him. If it was a first-time writer-director, and we've seen a lot of movies like that, where we're like, okay, bro, you've got your priorities all over the place with this movie. But if it's a Hughes film and you know what to expect, it's almost like he can get away with it and he knows it.
For me, I can forgive all that. I can forgive the fact that, you know what, the formula piece of it. But I think what the movie does do well is Ed O'Neill's stubbornness because they give him the setup really in a proper manner where he's this guy that built a business from the ground up. The dialogue explains it. He's trying to teach this kid a lesson and he goes all in on who he is with this kid. We get line over line of, I'm this tough guy. This is where I came from. And if he called for help and we get that pivotal scene at the truck stop where he kind of folds a little bit. And I think that is a transitional life moment that Hughes is really going for. Does it really land 100%? No. But at the same time, it really does show that we're sticking to this gun. We're sticking to our guns with the Ed O'Neill character, and he's going to be stubborn this entire time because that's how he was raised, and that's where the life lesson is going to come from. Is Ed O'Neill trying to teach this kid a life lesson? At this point, we don't know till the end because right now it's just a brat versus a stubborn old man and that loves his mom. So that's part of the general conflict that we have. And I think when we get into it, I think the transitional moment again doesn't really explore that. We get those 2 sentences of dialogue, the 4 sentences of dialogue from including the kid that really doesn't transition to the emotional element. So again, this makes sense. It was a July release, not a November release, because there is missing dialogue pieces to it to really take this movie up a notch. But given the Ed O'Neill character, I think it does a great job on sticking to what this man is. I think Hughes missed the boat on adding the emotional element. This isn't going to be a tearjerker that you're going to watch Thanksgiving and be like, oh, this is going to be one you're going to watch primarily if you're a fan of Ed O'Neill.
Well, and it does something right at the start of the third act that I really wanted more of, and I feel the film desperately lacked. And that was in the moment where they're in the homeless shelter and they're making the connection with the family that is on the road, lost their job, yet there is that human compassion. And you do see that character shift in Doyle's character where he lets the girl have the extra role and he's starting to understand what it means to be compassionate. That is a very formulaic Hughes thing where he throws that in there. Like in Home Alone, it would be the old man Morley stuff, right? It's that kind of stuff where there's going to be an emotional, sentimental moment. There's life lessons learned and things like that. Where I think Hughes messes up with that script is that is done in such a quick and passive way that I don't think he realized that that is where the real character shift and the real emotional driving moments are. And I think they should have doubled down on that a little bit more because it is so just fly through the numbers in this film that you almost forget about it once they're back on the road. And that should have been something that really would have driven the point home if they really focused on that. Almost as if like, if he's writing letters to these people, I don't know. I feel like that was a moment that was really poignant and we were kind of pushed through it and it made me want more of that because when Hughes does that and he writes it well, it really is my favorite part of a Hughes movie is when he does take that moment to show the compassion and sentimentality of the human experience and not just the funny and not just the formulaic, pratfalls.
Well, we have like 4 moments in this movie that it really could have given us that John Hughes feeling, that really emotional element. And again, we go back to the disappointment that's what Home Alone did a really good job on, is really putting in that emotional element to the goofiness. It was a good balance. But there are like 4 moments that you can really say, I can attach myself to this. I can attach myself on a deeper level to these characters, even to the final act where we get the family dropping off Ed O'Neill and the kid, where it's just a brief set of dialogue saying, call my office, we'll see what we can do. That could have gone further. And I think
that should have gone further.
It should have. And this is what's really missing. And if we had that emotional element, we could ignore a lot of these flaws from this movie. but we don't get that. And I don't know. And again, I hate putting this on all John Hughes because it is a direction problem. Because even if we elongate some of these scenes where it's just a sudden look, or if it's just a pan of the camera to gain that emotional element, then we could have gained something from it. But you know what? Words don't always have to be spoken to give us an emotional reaction. So I don't want to put it all on Hughes, even though the dialogue could have gone further, but the direction here could have gone a lot further to supplement a lot of that emotional feeling.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. Like the direction, I think, really is the issue 90% of the time, and not just with John Hughes scripts. So the director Peter Feynman, he's most notable for directing Crocodile Dundee, right? Australian director. They have a very different energy. They have a very different style of filmmaking. They find different things funny, and that's where I feel like sometimes this movie does feel off because the comic timing doesn't match the words. We've already had this conversation about this movie. It's like there's something off about it, but it doesn't take away from the entertainment for me. However, I can understand why a critic who does have high expectations, and as we have seen in their critiques of John Hughes movies, Roger's a fan, Gene's a fan when it works. And if it doesn't work, I feel like it's even a bigger disappointment to both of them. And that's kind of where this film lands. It's really hard to beat Planes, Trains, and Automobiles if you want that Hughes Thanksgiving experience that does do the funny and the compassion and the character turns in the most perfect way.
No, 100%. And again, this is one of those that it's a rarity to see Ed O'Neill in a leading role carrying a movie. And this one was targeted at the height, middle of Married with Children, that if you're a fan of the show, you'd like this performance because it feels familiar. And to me, I like this film because I do like Ed O'Neill, and I think it was a misstep in somewhere that I would have loved to see him in more leading roles, because I would have loved to see what he could have really stretched out to instead of being that stereotypical supporting role or the Al Bundy character. So this one is just almost a safe place for me to see. This is going to be probably the best Ed O'Neill lead performance that I'm going to get. So to me, that was entertainment enough for me to really enjoy it.
Yeah, sadly, I feel like he should have been the next Walter Matthau. I feel like that should have been the career path of things that Matthau didn't make in his youth, that never hit the screen. They should have sent to him because he does have that same kind of energy, that same kind of vibe. And there's a likability about him, but the likability is about how unlikable he actually is. The curmudgeon. Everyone loves a curmudgeon-y character, and we really didn't get many after Matthau. And I feel Ed O'Neill could have fit that gap perfectly, but it just never happened. So, yeah. All right, well, let's get into the reviews of our critics. And this is going to be a very interesting conversation because neither of these guys liked it.
Our next movie is Dutch, which tells the story of a private war between a very angry young boy and a man who wants to be his friend. The movie stars Ed O'Neill, star of Married with Children on TV, as a guy named Dutch who's in love with the ex-wife of a millionaire. Her son is a spoiled rich kid filled with hostility, but Dutch figures he might be able to turn the kid around if he goes to pick him up at his private school and drive him home for Thanksgiving. The movie turns into a formula picture where the two characters are somehow going to get to know one another while sharing adventures on the road. And, of course, they end up broke and stranded along the way. In a movie like this, there's an unwritten law that you never call home for money. No, you have to rough it out.
He has a lot of opinions on that, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying. For a film called Dutch, about a man called Dutch, I feel like it's not really a character-centric movie for Ed O'Neill. It's more of Doyle's movie in many ways. So maybe one of the reasons why they, I'm going to say, had an instant dislike or distaste for it is that if you're going to create a film and a title based on a centric character, and that character doesn't feel centric, then you're kind of creating a false expectation. Uncle Buck, you know exactly what you're getting. King Ralph, you know exactly what you're getting. This one's a little bit confusing because I swear, when I saw this movie as a kid, yeah, the guy's name is Dutch, but for all these years in my mind, I always thought the title meant into those two going Dutch, right? Like going 50-50, on the trip or the emotions or the experience. I created a metaphor or an analogy of the name for a movie that isn't even anything to do with the movie. It's just how it works because it doesn't feel like the movie is entirely about Ed O'Neill. And I think that's one of the things that really rubbed me the wrong way about it for the longest time.
Well, and we look at a lot of these kids' movies and Three Ninjas, Home Alone 3, whatever it may be. They put a lot of bearing on these kids on how well the character is liked, and rightfully so to an extent. How well it's written, or how they feel during the movie, or what's the intent of this kid. We have Gene calling a kid a mop top in Three Ninjas. So there's a lot bearing on how the child is going to carry this movie, and it's about the intent. And I think the intent doesn't overstay his welcome, in my opinion. And I think, like I stated earlier, I think with the Ed O'Neill character, I think the dialogue does a structured but okay job on creating the reason why Ed O'Neill is the way he is and why he doesn't want to call for help. So there's explanations there. And again, if we didn't have the conflict going into it, we wouldn't have a movie. There wouldn't be a road trip comedy coming down to it if we didn't have some of the cliche conflicts that we get in this movie. And we have to be okay with that when we're going into a movie like that. And even though it's John Hughes, there has to be a level of understanding of the intent of the audience that you're trying to please. Is this going for a Pretty in Pink? Is this going for the emotional element? Not necessarily, no. But this movie does entertain at an audience level. And I think there's a likability to what we're seeing on screen and a difficulty to have that likability on two characters that we might not necessarily like. So I think when it comes to the character design, I think it's on par because we can easily hate both of these characters, and I never got there to really hate both of these characters. The child, I think, was we know is going to come to an understanding, and it's the ending result that we're going to care about this kid. Ed O'Neill stays consistent during the entire movie, so I don't 100% agree with Roger on the cliche, the formula of the characters, at least.
Also, there's an incongruency of the motivation of Dutch because they don't really make it clear. And I don't know if that's in the writing or the performance of, is he doing this just to impress the JoBeth Williams character, or does he really want to create a relationship with this kid? I think it's a false flag. I don't think he really cares about creating a solid relationship with this kid at first. I think he just wants to show JoBeth Williams that he is there, he's available, he's devoted, he is committed to making this situation work. Because if he really wanted to make it work with the kid and not just impress the mom, then he maybe wouldn't come with such a hard-ass attitude right from the start. If he did, I'm not going to say bend over backwards for the kid, but approach it with a little less hard-nosed working class mentality, then he wouldn't get as much pushback at the beginning. I mean, the kid's still a dick, but I feel like we're left to decide for ourselves what his true motivations are, and until halfway through the movie, we really don't know. We don't know who he's really doing this for. And again, that makes me feel a little bit less committed to Dutch's character and his storyline.
Not to sound cynical or an asshole myself, but we got to understand the holistic nature, especially going into the early 90s, late 80s. And this is a man that's going in to meet a child that he's never met. He knows he loves the mother, and the way to the mother's heart is going to be through the child. And there's almost a natural hesitancy of how you're going to interact. And when you go off to this snot-nosed kid with money that didn't have to work for anything, and you have this character that worked his butt off to get to where he was, there's going to be a natural confliction there. And Ed O'Neill, I think that's where it really does shine in the first meeting, where he goes and he's almost putting up that defensive wall is, I don't really care where you come from because you had everything handed to you. I didn't. And I thought that was a brilliant introduction to how this conflict was going to go. But again, the execution didn't unfold the way I thought it was going to be when I first initially saw it. But I thought it was brilliant execution on how the introduction was. If we look at the outside in on how these two really react to their conflicting interactions with each other.
I also think that it does kind of speak to just that generation of parenting where this kid is in a boarding school and neither of his parents, even the mom who, on paper loves him and is devoted, committed, neither of his parents really know who he is or have taken the time to develop him. Otherwise, they wouldn't have shipped him off. Like, that is something we see a lot of in these movies. We talked about it in Man Without a Face, and especially how they compared it to Dead Poet Society and to Son of a Woman. Yeah, I feel like that is a generation of, like, if you can't be there for your kids, if work is too much, you're taking too much time away, well, you ship them off to boarding school and let someone else raise them and then wonder why they're an asshole later on their own.
It's a real strange country out there when you get a movie like this written and produced by John Hughes. This bears a passing resemblance to Hughes's wonderful movie Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which was also about an odd couple on the road home for Thanksgiving and all of their adventures and all of the reasons why they couldn't just pick up a phone and end the movie right then and there by getting some easily obtainable help. The movie has a lot of problems, but the basic one is it's not much fun to spend any time with this obnoxious kid who is presented as if the young William Buckley had been possessed by demons. That's not a criticism of young Ethan Randall, who plays the character all too well, but of Hughes' decision to make him so obnoxious for way too long before the inevitable smiles at the end of the picture. This was real.
I like the performance. I think that it is the exact right kind of child energy that we needed for this film. And everyone likes Home Alone, right? But if you had Macaulay Culkin in this role, I think it would be unbearable because he would have pushed the obnoxiousness and the spoiled brattiness of this kid way too far. There is an intelligence and a calculation into Ethan Randall's performance of this kid where even when he says something hurtful, you could almost see like an instant regret or maybe a second consideration to what he said or what he does in that scene, in that performance, in that action. And that's what keeps us going along with his performance, in my opinion. It's not 100% obnoxious. It's not 100% unforgivable. You can tell that he is putting on a facade of this pretentious rich kid attitude. And there's human feelings and emotions behind it. And that's what keeps me invested. I just have seen too many bratty kid perform. Scotty Schwartz, no, it would be too much. Macaulay Culkin, it would be too much. I think this kid's energy was perfect for this performance.
It really was. And Macaulay Culkin would have delivered every line as sarcastic, and that would have been obnoxious by itself.
It would have been the Uncle Buck performance, right?
100%. Yeah. And this is where I want to zero in on Roger here. And it's not a stab, but it's those of us that have dealt with kids, have dealt with especially 13-year-olds, have dealt with teenagers, know that there is a defense mechanism. There is a wall. There is an attitude. And when you take a critic and you have 30 to 45 minutes of introduction to this character, and that's too much for you. And I'm sitting here watching the rewatch saying, I get it. I get it. So not my kids, but I've seen it. But it's one of those that you have to have the understanding, because if you've dealt with teenagers, if you dealt with kids, you're going to have kind of an understanding of how this kid got there. Or even they kind of introduce it in the beginning of the movie of this loneliness, of this independence that he has, this pain that he has. And if you can't break through the dialogue just to see what he's going through, then that's somebody that, no offense to Roger, but you don't have kids, because there is a layer of damage here that you have to look through to see where this attitude is coming for. And I really did grab onto that with this movie.
Yeah, it's something that Hughes does really well, is he writes movies for families. You know, there are audiences that probably would not enjoy this because they don't have that kind of energy in their life. They don't have a kid with an attitude, or they don't have a family member who, okay, it's a working class guy and he's married to a formerly wealthy woman, or there's a rich ex-husband. Like, there are lots of layers to these movies that different social classes can attach themselves to. And that is where Hughes was very good at his job when it came to his writing and when it came to his directing, is he could literally write movies that could at least touch someone in a different social class, in a different, I mean, he did it well with ethnicities too. He just knew how to tell human stories that anyone in the audience could attach themselves to. It doesn't mean that the movie has to be about them and their social class, but they could recognize what he was doing and the kind of stories and characters he was creating. And this movie does do it very well. Then Gene jumps in.
Oh, yeah, teeth are on edge during this picture. Now, you took care of the kid. Let me talk about Dutch.
Old Dutch, yeah. Uh-huh.
I wouldn't want to spend any time with Dutch. You know, a guy who comes on and says, you know, I'm working class, I'm a regular guy. I mean, as soon as he says that, I want to, okay.
What's wrong with the working class? I work for a living. You know, there are times during the movie when you're rooting for the kid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The kid at least has a fresh attitude. I mean, Dutch is just so sanctimonious about himself.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, the economic scheme of this whole picture is the richer you are, the more of a jerk you are. The poorer you are, you're practically sainthood.
Of course, the formula of a road picture like this is you have the obstreperous person and then the other one who is going to use reason and also force to make the first person human.
Yeah.
Now, you've got a problem with a movie like this. You don't know which of the two characters from scene to scene is which.
You don't like either one.
Okay, so I'm going to say that is where I do agree with him, but not to the negative place that he's taking it. It goes back to where I was talking about energy, where these two have different energies that you really don't know whose story is whose at certain parts in the movie. That's the part that I had the problem with. I don't think their performances were bad. I think it's a script and structure issue, not as much a performance issue, because I don't find Ed Neal's performance grating, and I don't feel Ethan Randall's performance grating. So then what's wrong? It's the script. It is the fact that this does feel like something that Hughes wrote well, but it wasn't good enough for him to make, for him to direct. So I'm not saying it was a secondhand project that he was just kind of like wrote for the paycheck and someone was going to make it because he was still a hot commodity then, but it wasn't his A game. And I think he realizes that, and I think our critics are realizing that too, but they're taking it to a different level in the sense of their critique and not of the level of appreciating it as a John Hughes movie.
Yeah, I think there's going to be no debate that we've talked about that the script here is missing elements. It's not the strongest, and we can easily say it was miscast because it's supposed to go to John Candy or whatnot, but a script should be written for a good talent to execute it. And the script is missing elements here. But the one thing I will go on the defense with is Gene's comment of we don't know who to root for. And we're not supposed to be rooting for anybody. These are two individuals with conflict, internally and externally, that are going to battle. They're going to battle with the working class wits to the spoiled brat intelligence of a kid. That's the comedy of it. Now, is the comedy executed 100%? Absolutely not. But the characters and the conflict I can see through. I can see where these two really are almost one, just on different social classes. And that's what I really did like about it, is that they're both in a place where they appreciate their own self and they have to compete with that. They have to put their egos at a test when it comes to their conflict. So that I'm not going to put on the table, and I don't agree with that because I saw through that. But I will agree that the dialogue isn't there when it comes to the execution of what Hughes is trying to do.
And I don't think we get enough of JoBeth Williams or even Ethan Randall's backstory enough to understand what this relationship's going to look like once they're out of this fancy house, you know, because Christopher McDonald comes along and it's like, okay, you guys got till Monday to get out. And Ed O'Neill's kind of roughs him up and he goes, okay, we're going to give another 6 months. But then what happens after that? Like, are we really supposed to just accept the fact that they're going to live this blue collar middle class lifestyle with Ed O'Neill and not have any, reservations about it, not have any hesitations going right into it? I feel like the ending doesn't give us enough closure. We're supposed to go out on a ray of hope because it's Thanksgiving and, hey, mom is finally happy. We're going to live in this dude's whatever he lives in. I'm assuming it's just like a brownstone in the lower end of Chicago. I don't know. But I feel like the ending's a little bit empty too because we don't know. We don't have a good enough closure on how these people feel about this situation. And it doesn't feel like a film that was going to be set up for a sequel, but I just don't feel like I was given enough information about her character and about what this future is with this family. Or is this just Thanksgiving, and now everything's over because it's just too much pressure for the family unit, right? There's just something about it that doesn't sit right with me at the end. That I think that might be another issue too, because at least with plane, trains, and automobiles, we had the nice dinner at the end, and there's a ray of hope. He's going to get his life back together somehow. I don't really feel that with this one. If anything, I feel like more of an ominous future for these people, and that kind of makes me feel uneasy about the ending.
This was a copy and paste of McDonald at the end of Flubber. So to me,
It was.
this one was like a McDonald ending where I really, during my rewatch, I just asked myself, I want to see the parenting plan to this, because who has control of this kid? And we don't get those questions answered. And it went into that cliche of what we're going to see from Hughes going on to the next 5-10 years, of just that cliche kind of fluffiness to just kind of put a bow on it. And there's no explanation to it. We do feel good and okay with the ending, but there are lingering questions of why, what. Let's back up a little bit here and explain this. You have this rich dick that really doesn't have any say in the kid when it comes to where he's going for Thanksgiving, that we saw in the dialogue. But then the mom has to be kicked out of this house. So it was rushed way too much to really put that perfect holiday bow on it. But you put some decorations on the table, you put a turkey dinner on the table, and we all feel good. The bad guy gets knocked in the head, and we all feel good. The ending is 100% cliche, and that's the one biggest problem I did have with this movie, is how rushed the ending was without really closing up some gaps to what this family is or how they're going to continue.
Right. And I think at the end of the day, when it comes to, like I said, perennial favorites, I don't hear this talked about a lot. It is a cult film in a sense. Low box office, hard to stream. It's not streaming anywhere. Lucky for me, I have it on DVD. But that is one of the things that makes it kind of special, is the fact that it's underrated, undersung, but maybe that's the way it should be. And it didn't hit the box office because it didn't hit the right notes for the mainstream audiences. But people like you and me who watch it and appreciate it, we can recognize the flaws and still be like, you know what? I still like these people. And the fact that we're getting an Ed O'Neill movie when we didn't get many after that. So yeah, I think it does have a very special place in the cult cinema circle. When it comes to the critiques, for my guy, Gene, this really was Roger's review. Gene only chimes in for a minute, and it's mostly about like, oh, I would hate hanging out with Ed O'Neill. And that's really it. He doesn't really bring anything else to the table. Now, I don't know if that is a time constraint thing or if they just wanted to kind of get through this review and on to the next one. That's kind of how it feels. So I agree with him more than I disagree, but that doesn't mean I don't like the film. So for his critique, I'm going to give him a solid C, because he didn't chime in more than he did. And I feel he could have given a lot more insight rather than just agreeing with Roger that Ed O'Neill's character left a lot to be desired.
I can see that. And again, I don't disagree with some of the things that were said. And it's one of those movies I can recognize a lot of the flaws, but this is one of those movies that we've talked about time and time again, is there are certain things that we connect with, that we can have that rewatch value, that we can really appreciate for the rewatch value. But I didn't connect with Roger's review here, because everything I liked about the movie, he disliked. And the things that we've recognized that are the obvious flaws, they ignored. Roger didn't talk about the cliche ending, the gaps in the emotional element. And I get they're on time constraints on the review, but all they talked about were the characters without giving the appreciation of the performances, because the performances are good. They are decent. They do keep us engaged. If you don't connect with the relatability of the kid, fine. You might not be in that relatable place where you don't have kids. Ed O'Neill, the working class, you don't relate on that because you have money. I get it. But I related with him. I related with the kid. I can understand the kid, and I can relate to Ed O'Neill. So that is the entertainment value of it. So with Roger, I'm going to give 2 stars.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought this to the table, because it's a great way to kind of kick off the holiday movies, because we're here, man. Like, the year's almost up. We got some Thanksgiving movies, we've got some Christmas movies, and then we're jumping right into New Year's, and then that's our year, our first year of being a podcast, and roughly 52 episodes of these critiques that they got their highs, they got their lows, and they got their moments where it's like, I really can't disagree with them, but I like the film for what it is, and that's what this is. So yeah. Now, getting into the holiday movies. Next week is my pick. Doing a couple Thanksgiving movies, then we're right into Christmas movies. So you brought your Thanksgiving treat. My Thanksgiving treat is we are going to do Jodie Foster's, not directorial debut, but I think one of her most ambitious directorial efforts, and that is Home for the Holidays, starring Holly Hunter, Robert Downey Jr., Charles Durning, Anne Bancroft. Great cast, but is it a great movie? We will find out.
Can't wait for that one. That one's going to be a great conversation.
Great conversation for a very interesting movie with, a lot of controversial and interesting people involved. And to see where they're at now compared to when this film came out, it's just really, really interesting to me. Just the direction that everyone's gone. But we'll save it for that conversation. So everyone, thank you for watching, listening. Like we said, Dutch is hard to find on streaming. It's not streaming anywhere. So if you want to watch it, do yourself a favor, hop on Amazon or eBay, buy a DVD, find a VHS. I'm not even sure if I could find a Blu-ray out there. But yeah, it should be something you could work into your holiday routine if you can find it. Please like, review, rate, subscribe, 5 stars, all that good stuff. And you can find me on my other show, the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast, at thecultworthy.com. Justin, you can find all of his stuff at
themoviewire.com.
And we are going into our new season after the holidays, so like we always say, send us picks, send us recommendations. If Siskel and Ebert covered it on their show and you want to see us cover it, let us know. Shoot us an email, find us on Facebook, on Instagram, or at either of our websites, and we will get it in there. And man, it's a pleasure, and I'll see you next week.